You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Coming up, we'll look at the viability of self-deportation following a demand for undocumented residents to do so by the Secretary of Homeland Security. And the Orlando Curling Club is encouraging Central Floridians to partake in a sport that's been gaining traction in the United States thanks to Olympic coverage. But first, some Florida lawmakers are floating the idea of eliminating property taxes. Property taxes help pay for critical local services, from police and fire departments to road repairs and parks to sanitation services and schools. These taxes people pay for owning property are not collected by the state. They're levied by local governments, and the rates that homeowners pay vary by city or county. Sean Snaith, director of UCF's Institute for Economic Forecasting, explains why municipalities rely on the funding.
The one thing about property tax is it's a more stable source of revenue. The housing bubble collapse in 08, 09 notwithstanding, the business cycle, recessions, et cetera, can impact other types of tax revenues in a way that property taxes are not impacted. So there may come with a removal of the property tax, increased volatility over time in revenues for local governments and these other local public services.
Governor Ron DeSantis posted on social media that he supports eliminating property taxes, a move that would require a constitutional amendment approved by 60% of Florida voters. Then on Tuesday, Republican State Senator Jonathan Martin of Fort Myers filed a bill ordering a study to analyze the impact of getting rid of the revenue on public services, including education, infrastructure, and emergency services, and long-term economic growth. As a leading local economist, we asked Sean Snaith to talk about what could happen if property taxes are eliminated and what it could mean for Central Florida. Snaith starts by discussing how local communities use the funding generated.
Yeah, well, I think it's local governments, that oversee how these property taxes are distributed. So some of it goes to fund, the general funds of government. And so you have your local, county commission and mayor here in Orange County that, approve budgets and how to spend that general fund money. But then there are property taxes when you get your bill as a homeowner that break down exactly where some of these property taxes are going. So you'll see separate assessments for schools or public safety, fire, law enforcement, things along those levels.
Thinking about those agencies, law enforcement, social services, fire districts, schools, how would these services receive funding if not from property taxes?
Well, I think most people are in agreement that we want to fund, law enforcement and firefighters and schools. So if not via a property tax, then that money would have to come from some other source of revenue. And so what's been, mentioned, but not necessarily the only possibility is to replace the property tax revenue with some sort of consumption tax, a sales tax. And I think that has to be, this is part of the complexity of it. How much of a sales tax would have to be levied to replace the loss of property taxes? There are other possibilities where some of these services are paid for directly by Floridians, but I think the simplest way may be just to switch one type of tax for another. In this case, property tax for some type of sales tax. I don't think that an income tax is on the table here in Florida in any way, shape, or form, but that would be, in other states, certainly income taxes are used to pay for some of these services as well.
I feel like if residents started hearing talks of an income tax, there would be quite the outcry to that.
I don't think it's a politically feasible option in Florida at this point in time. I think when the study comes out, assuming that it's, approved and it's completed and, the options are sort of laid out for here's what we can do if we get rid of the property tax, then this will become more clear. I think right now, and I don't know if there's been any polling done, but I would imagine you probably would have enough people in favor to pass some type of I believe it would have to be a constitutional amendment. I'm not a political scientist, but to eliminate the property tax in the state. But that's just the notion of, oh, would you like to see your taxes go away? Oh, yes, I'd be in favor of that, but without the reality of how that's going to be implemented and what it means in terms of where the funding will come from after that. I think as I said, I think that there's an environment right now because there's a lot of change going on at the federal government level that people have concerns over the property tax, certainly because it's even though you own the land and you own the structures on the land, if you don't pay your property taxes, you could lose all that. And so I think for some that's problematic. I think we hear a lot about people that are on fixed incomes, retirees that have to continue to pay property taxes, and so their income might not be changing, but for example, in those few years in the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a tremendous increase in home values and home prices that have sustained really to this day for the most part. And so along with those increases, people see the assessments of their homes and their property taxes go up. Their incomes, if you're retired, may not have followed suit. So there's certainly issues with the property tax, and there's been tinkering with it, with the various homestead exemptions and granting exemptions to other subgroups of the population. But right now, it is the cornerstone of revenue at the local government level and for many of our public services.
When we're talking about eliminating property taxes, who do you think would be the most impacted?
Um, and again, the details are so scarce here. Are they eliminating property taxes, potentially just for residential property taxes? Well, that would be, anybody that owns a home would you know, benefit at least from not having to pay that tax. It's not clear how their, tax burden would change when something else is introduced to replace that revenue. But it's possible that they could keep it on commercial real estate. But basically, property taxes are paid by the owners of that property. And so they would no longer have to pay those taxes. But again, the devil's in the details, certainly, with what other taxes or fees would be implemented to replace that lost revenue. And so, you kind of have to have this full proposal on the table to get a sense of who's winning, who's losing, if anybody, or if it's just shuffling the tax chairs on the deck of the Titanic, if you will.
Could this be considered a regressive tax?
I mean, typically not, although though it certainly can be in the case of folks who are spending a higher proportion of their income on shelter. So lower income people, though they're not necessarily paying it directly, they do spend a larger share of their monthly budget on housing. So even if that's rent, portion of that rent is going to pay property taxes, even if they're not the owner of the property. Sales tax is typically regarded as a more regressive type of tax.
As we see conversations about this move forward, what do you think Central Floridians should be looking for and keeping an eye on with this discussion about eliminating property taxes?
Well, I think we need to wait, and that includes myself, for what's being proposed. What does the study show? What are the options? What would some amendment? What would the wording be? What would what's going to replace that revenue that would no longer come from property taxes? And so, you know, there's many ways that it could happen in a mix of different taxes or fees or direct charging of users to replace that revenue. So I think right now for most listeners, trying to do the math here is going to be impossible because we don't have all the variables. We don't have answers for everything that's part of this equation in terms of assessing, whether this is a good move or not. There could be, another possibility too is tourism related taxes could be used to replace some of that property tax revenue, and so that, in large part pushes most of the burden to people who don't live in the state. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that coming into the conversation as this proposal is mulled over and studied in the weeks and months ahead.
Sean Snaith is a director of UCF's Institute for Economic Forecasting. There's more ahead here on Engage. This week, the Department of Homeland Security launched a multi-million-dollar ad campaign warning illegal immigrants to self-deport if they want the chance to return to America. We'll discuss the real meaning of self-deportation with a local immigration attorney and the cases he's working on with Central Florida families that he says keep him awake at night. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, watching the sport of curling on TV makes it seem so easy. It's hard to believe it's an Olympic event.
Like every other sport, it takes a lifetime of practice to get good at. The joke we kind of make about this is like, we're not curling because it's easy. We're curling because we thought it was easy.
Later on Engage, producer Richard Copeland ventures to Kissimmee to meet the Orlando Curling Club. But first, on Monday, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security announced an ad campaign warning immigrants in the country illegally to leave on their own or be deported and never allowed to return to the United States. Here's part of a video released by DHS Secretary Kristi Noem.
President Trump has a clear message for those that are in our country illegally. Leave now. If you don't, we will find you and we will deport you. You will never return. For too long, weak politicians left our borders wide open. They flooded our communities with drugs, human trafficking, and violent criminals. They put American lives at risk. Well, those days are over. If you leave now, you may have an opportunity to return and enjoy our freedom and live the American dream. But understand this. Under President Trump, America's borders are closed to lawbreakers. Follow the law, and you'll find opportunity. Break it, and you'll find consequences.
DHS says those ads will run on radio, broadcast, and digital, nationally and internationally. Following the release of the video, we reached out to Nayef Mubarak, an immigration and personal injury attorney with Mubarak Law in Orlando, to talk about self-deportation as an option and means of combating illegal immigration. He joins Engage to discuss the implications of the ad campaign and what it really means to self-deport. I began our discussion by asking Mubarak about his take on the DHS video promoting self-deportation.
The video is part promotional for the administration's agenda, letting those supporters of his immigration enforcement know what they're working on. It sends like a strong enforcement show of force, and also slightly can show their cards a little bit by the fact there's limited resources in removing all of these people in this country. So, whether they deputize IRS agents or USCIS agents, all for enforcement, they're still going to have a hard time physically removing all of these people. And I think that the self-deportation is a way to alleviate some of that stress for them. There's even some comments about if we find you, you'll never come back again, with some of these threats, and that you may have an option if you leave on your own. So I think it's slightly misleading, and it's intended to show people that it's better to leave on your own than to go through the system or the court system, which can cost several, thousands or millions of dollars for them, and also take several years to go through a court process.
What do you think is misleading about the messaging in the video?
Well, if you are deported from the United States or ordered removed by an immigration judge, the penalty is a 10-year penalty. So that might be forever or never coming back for some people, but technically speaking, there are even waivers for deportation that some may qualify, or you may be eligible for a visa in 10 years. And then when she goes on to state that you may have the ability to return in the future, it's a common misconception that if leaving on your own can be better than having a deportation order under your name or your file, which is true in some circumstances. However, in addition to a 10-year penalty for a deportation order, there's also a 10-year penalty for being unlawfully present in the United States for more than 1 year. So sometimes even in court proceedings, if you see somebody with an inexperienced attorney or without an attorney and the judge offers an individual voluntary departure, meaning leaving on your own, that it sounds better than having an order of removal. Well, technically, if you've been here for more than 1 year, without status, you have the same penalty of 10 years, unable to seek admission in the United States again. So that is a little bit misleading in the sense that it's somehow better. It can be in some situations, but again, all of these cannot be grouped into, two different categories. Each case has so many different factors that need to be considered.
Okay, so what does self-deportation entail?
Well, it's not really a procedure or, legal term that's like in the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's something that's kind of been coined, just like a green card, right? It's a resident card, but self-deportation simply means leaving on your own. Booking a plane ticket and heading back to your home country or where you're able to enter. You're not going through a process where you are declaring I'm self-deporting and they notate that you've left. Many times when people do decide to leave or they leave on their own, we tell our clients or individuals to make sure you keep proof that you left. So there's record that you've actually left, because there isn't a formal process. Now, if you accepted voluntary departure from an immigration judge, it's clear that you have an order from a judge signed giving you voluntary departure and you departed. But self-deportation, at least in my understanding of that video from DHS, is basically just leave on your own. Leave the country, book a flight, and head out. And I think that is an intimidation factor, and also, help with their resources.
So there's no formal program that you're applying to get help covering the cost of that flight. That's just all on you, right?
Correct. It just means, book a flight home, essentially. You are removing yourself. I've even made some videos. I've had some real stories where people, last year, August, I think we're on a flight to Puerto Rico and the plane had an emergency landing in the Bahamas. Well, did they self-deport by landing outside of the United States boundaries? That simply means leaving without permission or leaving without completing your process formally. Essentially, when you leave the United States borders and you were out of status, you have self-deported because you've now triggered your unlawful presence bars. You don't have a right to return. You've done so without having a formal deportation.
Have you heard any concerns from people who are weighing self-deportation, or what would your advice be to the immigrant community who may be thinking about it?
It's unfortunate in the sense that many people who are trying to abide by the laws or go through the procedures are now getting very discouraged or are truly fearful of this administration, and the horror stories of the detention camps and how difficult it is to remain there. So many of our clients are, well, if this doesn't work, I'm going to leave immediately. Like, I don't want to be in a jail. So this fear or this show of force is working. But it's discouraging because many people are going through what this administration says doing it lawfully or doing it legally, however, continues to remove avenues of that, right? Continues to remove asylum at the southern border, which is very much a legal process. Firing immigration judges, causing a backlog. We've now heard that yesterday there was going to be additional firings in DHS for those who might not be willing to enforce this administration's agenda. So if you continue to remove the resources that allow for legal processes, what avenues are really left? You've essentially are shutting down the system or slowing it down to, a screeching halt. So many people are terrified that if their case isn't resolved, even though they've done things lawfully, are they going to end up in one of these facilities where the conditions are terrible? So I think before anybody over reacts or thinks that this is the only solution, every person who is considering this or who has family here or who hasn't spoken to an attorney needs to really do a full evaluation of their circumstances to determine if they have options or not. Many people don't realize that there's so many different avenues to fix one's status, and then sometimes there's not. So, I mean, if you come to the conclusion that there's no relief and living in fear is not for you, then that might be the option for you if you have circumstances back home that are not terrible. For some people, going home is not an option, and they're going to take their chances on being here. We're just seeing also, in a way, an increase of people. I practice in Florida. Immigration's federal, and we represent clients all over. But for the individuals who are in Florida, many are considering leaving because of the kind of double increase in not only the federal policies, but also now state level policies, which is making it very difficult for immigrants in Florida.
I want to ask you more about the people who are leaving the state. First, speaking on this issue of self-deportation, what would parents do who are here undocumented, but their kids were born here? Like, what kind of advice do you even give families in this situation?
That's the tough part, right? So we have parents we see all the time that have been here for like 30 years, whose children are US citizens, but due to that parent's mother or father's manner of entry, there is no clear avenue to lawfully change their status. You can sponsor your parent, but if they don't have proof of a legal entry, we can't adjust inside the United States. Well, we have something called a provisional waiver for spouses or adult children, meaning that we can pardon or forgive them for that unlawful presence. However, we don't have that for parents. So there's like these loopholes that occur, where some relatives qualify for relief and waivers and some do not. And it was under President Obama, just like we had DACA, there was supposed to be a DAPA program, DAPA, and that kind of got shot down and never was resurrected again. So we don't have provisional waivers or hardship waivers for those individuals, which means if they leave the US to process their immigrant visa, they're supposed to be waiting outside for 10 years if we can't find a waiver that fits for them. Whereas spouses or adult children typically can wait inside the United States while that waiver is pending and will have an idea before they leave if they have been approved for forgiveness per se, so that they can return very quickly after their consular interview. So for many parents who have children and who have been here for 20, 30 years, I mean, I see it all the time, there's a lot of times no options for them. And they've just no criminal history, paying taxes. We just simply don't have something in place that would allow for them to adjust their status.
I want to go back to what you were speaking about earlier when we were discussing more people considering leaving the state of Florida. Which policies in Florida are proving to be the most problematic, most challenging, that's encouraging people to leave this state specifically?
Well, there was 2 or 3 years ago, Governor DeSantis did a state bill basically saying if you're an undocumented person is traveling in your car, that could be a criminal charge for the person who is driving the car. And we did see, I want to say it's SB 1718. I would have to verify that, but I want to double check that. However, that there was many questions about enforcement issues, like how are you going to pull somebody over and verify? But we did see many in the construction industry and farming industry that kind of backfired for those people who were supporters of DeSantis, who then saw their workforce leaving. Now, just last week, Governor DeSantis signed the Florida 2025 immigration bill, which says if you entered the country unauthorized and you are present in the state of Florida, you can now be charged with a misdemeanor criminal offense. So simply being present here without status has now become a criminal charge, which was never the case before. And this is really starting to instill fear in individuals, where there's a mandatory sentence of 9 months. And once you get into a detention facility under state law, then ICE is notified, and then your ICE deportation proceedings are picked up. So that's one of the items. Additionally, Florida is probably one of the hardest states to get simply a driver's license. The documents that they require, even with certain cases pending with USCIS or an immigration agency, sometimes you don't have enough documents that they require to obtain a valid Florida driver's license. So driving becomes impossible. So these are the things that are really starting to eat away at the immigrant community that's in Florida, in which Florida relies so heavily on in their workforce. We also now, with temporary protected status, this is just very relative to Florida as well, with over 200,000 Venezuelans with this status in the state of Florida, one of the largest Haitian TPS populations. They're now very fearful of TPS ending, and now being coupled with the Florida laws, it just doesn't seem like a safe environment for them. And so many of them are considering leaving if they haven't left.
Are your clients scared?
Yes. It's to the point where it's sometimes without reason. I really don't know what news outlets or what they're hearing or what they're seeing on social media, where I have people with green cards calling me out of fear, permanent residents of the United States, saying, can I go to the grocery store? Can I travel? So this fear that is being instilled is real. I went to a colleague's restaurant of mine, and he's like, man, every employee is tense. And I said, well, don't they have status? He's like, yeah, exactly. We comply with the verifications, but because they're not citizens and we work in a restaurant, they're worried about some raid that might occur and might accidentally get picked up and removed. Like these are fears that I used to think were just unreasonable or unfounded, but I find it more and more people calling me who are lawfully here, who have every right to be here, whose case was approved, and are living in fear.
And what would you say to the people who would make the argument that there are laws in place? Undocumented people are breaking the law and are here illegally.
Well, we definitely need border and security, and there are laws in place. However, we need a reasonable immigration system that works. We cannot complain about the cost of goods in our country and eggs and products, and then not have a workforce where the majority of the workforce comes from these communities. We cannot claim we want something to be done lawfully, but then there is no process for it, like the parents of U.S. citizen children who are here. How does one do something lawfully if there is no avenue for it? So I think there's a big misconception of people who support the enforcement of these laws and things to be done lawfully. And if you've broken the law, you should be punished. When they find out that their neighbor's parent is being removed or deported and they've never committed a crime, they are truly perplexed by them not having an avenue. We've had people call and they would say, I want to sponsor my neighbor. He's a good person and he's one of the good ones and he should be here. And I said, okay, well, we start doing a background check and we do an analysis and we determine that this person has no options. And so they do something, this person wants to do it the right way. I said, well, the right way in this person's set of facts do not exist. And that is the problem with hundreds of thousands, if not more people, millions probably, who, because of one single event, there is no longer a right way available to them. So we need to have some type of comprehensive immigration reform. And even our dreamers, they've never even committed a violation if they were brought here as minors. So how does one in that set of facts do something the right way if there is no legal right way?
Is there a case you're working on right now, or a family you're working with, someone in this community, a case that just keeps you up at night?
There are several, right? Right. So there's individuals who are stateless Palestinians who came here on student visas in the 80s and 90s and have deportation orders because the court didn't grant their asylum 30 years ago, who are now married to US citizens and have children, but we cannot get their green card despite them entering lawfully and being married and no criminal history and the multiple US citizen family members, because we cannot get the immigration judge to reopen the deportation order from 30 years ago. I mean, this is the kind of things that we deal with the new Lake and Riley Act, with the making mandatory bonds. If somebody is accused of a petty theft offense, not even convicted, but simply arrested for, are they going to be subject to mandatory detention with no bond? You know, there's concerns about families being ripped apart who've not committed crimes. Like we have, the immigration law does have disqualifiers for certain criminal activity. We aren't issuing as a country green cards to people with murder convictions, right? But we are also excluding people from permanent residency or getting from their green cards because of their manner of entry from 20, 30 years ago, or from a administrative order that we simply can't undo or reopen. So there's these people who are low-hanging fruit for the administration to remove. And we had cases pending and we're in the process, but it's one of these circumstances as to which, shoe is going to drop first. Will the case be approved, or will we get it reopened, or will they be apprehended or picked up? So it seems to be in some of these clients' cases an all or nothing. There's no middle ground.
That was attorney Nayef Mubarak with Mubarak Law in Orlando. We also reached out to Orlando immigration lawyer Gail Seram. She says she's advising her clients to not self-deport.
Telling people to self-deport is assuming that people have no legal options to remain in the United States. Yes, we have people who are in the US that may have entered illegally or who may entered and overstayed their visa, but there may be options available to those individuals. So people should explore their options and also understand the consequences of departing before making such a drastic decision.
What are those consequences?
So anyone who has entered the US and has overstayed, either overstayed on their visa, whether it's like a student visa or a work visa, or anyone who's just entered through the border illegally and is just here with unlawful physical presence. If these individuals, so what I'm about to talk about is something called the unlawful presence ban, and this is in the Immigration and Nationality Act. And what the unlawful presence ban states is that if you're in the US and you've been here unlawful for less than a year, and then you depart, going back to this video about depart. If you've been unlawful for less than a year and you depart, then you have a 3-year ban from returning to the United States. It also says if you've been unlawful in the US for more than a year and then you depart, then you have a 10-year ban from returning to the US. So first and foremost, people need to understand if they have accumulated unlawful presence in the US, which is just being here physically unlawfully, and then you just decide to depart, you will have a ban from returning to the US. And what that means is that if you want to return to the US prior to the end of your ban, then you have to file a waiver asking the US government permission to return to the US based on extreme hardship to a qualifying relative, such as a US citizen spouse or US citizen child. And these waivers right now to try to return can take 2 to 3 years. But again, you're asking the government for permission to return.
That was Orlando immigration lawyer Gail Seram. Coming up, U.S. Olympic trials for curling are this week on the road to the Winter Games in 2026. Next on Engage, we'll step on the ice at the home of Central Florida's curling club, where fans of the sport meet every week. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Central Florida saw a midwinter heat wave earlier this month. Engage producer Richard Copeland found an icy respite from the heat on a Sunday morning in Kissimmee.
It's nearly 8:30 in the morning at the Ice Factory in Central Florida. There's a 4-on-4 hockey game taking place on a side rink. On the main ice, though, the Orlando Curling Club is setting up for their weekly session. Curling is one of those sports that most Americans get excited about during the Olympics. In the years in between, the sport goes largely forgotten, as evidenced by the lack of TV coverage in the 47 months between Winter Games. But here in Central Florida, there are a few die-hard curlers, many of whom grew up with curling as part of a family tradition.
For me at the time in Minnesota, it was more common than other places probably, but still most of my friends at school and stuff, when I was like, yeah, I curl on Saturdays, they're like, what is this? Nobody knew. It was a pretty small community, but pretty tight community. Those who did curl were kind of all in on it, and just a great group of people, and it was kind of a second home for me growing up. So,
Do you remember your first time out curling?
I do, actually. Well, I remember the first time on the ice. What got us hooked is my dad took my brother and I one night. He was playing in a league game, and he took my brother and I down to the club because he didn't have a sitter, whatever it was. He parked us behind the glass and said, I'm going to go do this. You sit here, drink your soda and your chips, and don't move. And we were enthralled. We just watched the whole game, and then afterwards he brought us out on the ice and let us kind of push a rock around a little bit and see it for ourselves. And I think one of his teammates was like, there's a Saturday morning juniors. They could play in and learn the game. And we're like, yeah, we want to. And it's like, you guys aren't going to get up in the morning. We were never morning people. So sure enough, that first Saturday, we were up an hour before we had to leave, ready to go. And both of us were just kind of all in on it.
That's Bill Morrison, the director of the Orlando Curling Club. He's preparing the ice for a curling session, along with Travis Howe, the club's vice president. While a glass smooth Zamboni'd surface is preferable for hockey players and figure skaters, curlers require a rougher surface for optimal curling. It's kind of like a pitcher scuffing a ball for a better curve. Travis is walking the playing court, called a curling sheet, with a water tank strapped to his back, spraying a fine mist on the already frozen floor.
The little water droplets hit the ice and create kind of a curve, and then we cut off the top, which creates sharp corners. The running surface of the rock, I can show you too. It's only a small section that actually touches the ice. It's really only here.
So there's sort of a cushion of air.
Right, and this runs along the edge and then grabs in between the pebble and those corners and pulls the rock in one direction or the other, which is actually what gives you the curl.
While Bill and Travis prepare the ice, other club members start unloading the curling stones, referred to as rocks by the players. 16 rocks lay across the ice, each about 2 feet in diameter and about 6 inches high. They're perfectly polished granite topped with a large plastic handle. Though they seem to glide effortlessly across the ice, these rocks are heavy.
I think it's between 40 point some pounds and 42 point something is an official curling stone. I forget the exact measurements, but we always say it's about 42 pounds of granite with a plastic handle. There's something they do at the highest level they call matching rocks, where teams will have a rock book and they'll know every single rock and every single sheet and what its tendencies are, because the set of stones are identified, so they know from tournament to tournament which stones we're playing. And they'll keep books on these. So they'll have an alternate or a fifth player who a lot of times they'll be just kind of throwing stones to see how much they're curling, how straight they are. They'll look for straight ones, different tendencies in different rocks. So being the first to figure that out and know what stones you're playing, and maybe your skip wants to throw a different stone than your lead because it curls more and you want to save that one for the end or something. So, and not only that, but every sheet of ice is different and will change throughout the game. So you'll hear a lot of numbers and clocks, so they'll have stopwatches. We'll take different split times of the rock, and we'll look at like how fast it took from get to one point to another, and that'll kind of give us an indication of how fast the ice is playing, and will actually inform the shot that you're throwing. So there's a ton of analytics in curling, which has honestly only come the last, again, I think 20, 25 years maybe.
Curling is somewhere between shuffleboard and bocce, but played on ice with 40-pound rocks. The idea is simple. Slide as many of your rocks into a circle 150 feet away and try to knock your opponent's rocks out of the circle. Despite its simplicity, a winning curling team requires intense cooperation and strategizing, as club president Jim Windsor points out.
Basically, the red team was sitting 3 points. We were trying to basically get our stone in there and score a single point by taking over the center position in the house. Unfortunately, we were a little off in reading the ice and the amount of curl and so forth, and just barely missed going through that stone, but we did catch one of the ones in behind. So we cut them off by a couple of points, so they ended up only scoring one instead of three, but we obviously would have preferred to score one for our side.
So it's kind of like giving up a field goal rather than a touchdown.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're trying to, okay, maybe we can't quite score, but we definitely don't, want to let them in for a big score at their end. So
It looked like a very intense meeting for a moment there.
yes and no. It's the first end. So a lot of the first end, you're trying to get a read on the ice, what the speed is, how much it's curling today, because every time we're out here, it's a little bit different. So, yeah, we were trying to score a point, but cutting them down to a single is good too, and we kind of think we have a feel for what it's going to do for the next end here. So we'll find out.
Okay, we'll sit here or up top is good. You want to go regular?
Teammates use a scouring pad on a stick called a broom to manipulate the surface of the ice in front of the sliding rock, either speeding it up, slowing it down, or changing the trajectory of the rock's path.
Okay, stay close. Really got to curl. Yeah, hard. Really coming off.
So sweeping does a couple of things. Number one, basically what you're doing is you're reducing friction on the ice in front of the stone. You're polishing the ice. Less friction means it's going to go further than it normally would have. But the name of the game is curling. The stone doesn't go in a straight line, it goes in an arc, and most of that curve is at the end when it's slowing down. So by adjusting the speed, you're also adjusting it left and right. The bottom line is, the thrower is throwing the stone, the sweepers are adjusting that to kind of get it exactly where they want that stone to end up.
And I saw the thrower give a little bit of a twist on the rock as you let it go. Is a little bit of English?
Absolutely. So the stones on the ice will curl in an arc no matter what. It will never go straight. The problem is you don't know which way it's going to go. It's going to just naturally pick one. By giving that stone a little bit of a spin as you release it, it forces the stone to curl the way you want it to, either off to the left or off to the right.
I recall watching many hours of curling during recent Winter Olympics. It's hard to miss with the round-the-clock coverage afforded by the networks. I remember thinking how easy curling looked. It's not fast-paced. It seems almost like a leisurely backyard round of lawn darts, the kind of sport one could excel in while holding a hot dog. But I also know that curling looks deceptively easy. Something had to make Olympic-caliber athletes stand out from weekend beer leaguers. Again, club president Jim Windsor explained the nuance of curling.
It looks very easy on TV. And of course, Tom Brady throwing touchdowns looks very easy on TV. The reality is it's not as easy as you think it is. It's one of those sports that anyone can play, but like every other sport, it takes a lifetime of practice to get good at. The joke we kind of make about this is like, we're not curling because it's easy. We're curling because we thought it was easy.
I watched these guys play a couple rounds. While I loosely understood the gist of curling, I was waiting for something to happen that would elicit a celebration, something akin to an end zone dance, that would indicate a major score or even a win. These guys, like the pros I'd seen on ESPN, were sublimely reserved.
Yep.
The assumption that all members of the Orlando Curling Club somehow landed in Central Florida from Canada or Minnesota is false. Televised curling in recent Olympics have expanded the interest level among Americans. Windsor explained that curiosity drives as much traffic to the club as tradition.
So we get a lot of people that we call them bucket listers, right? That this is like, they've seen this, they always wanted to try it, it looks so cool. And yeah, we host weekly Learn to Curls, and we get, people from all over that want to just try this out the one time, right? And, some people are like, okay, I've checked the box, I'm good, and so forth. A lot of other people are like, oh, this is like really cool, and I just want to keep doing this. So we get a lot of people that, wanted to just try it out and decided they loved it, and they're still with us. And, we actually get curlers from other places in the U.S. that are down here on vacation for other things. And they're like, hey, I'm a curler from Minnesota or New York or wherever. Can I come play with you this weekend? I'm down in town. And we're like, yeah, sure, come. So we get, we get all kinds of people. We also have a lot of Canadian snowbirds that are, of course, down here for the winter that, they curl a little bit up north at the start of the season, and then they come down here and play with us.
After about 90 minutes of standing on the ice, I could no longer feel my feet. But there was something hypnotic about the rhythm of curling, the drone of the granite sliding down the ice, the anticipation of the deep, crisp clunk of the rocks hitting each other, and the banter between teammates directing each other where and how hard to sweep the ice. I wanted to be part of that. Travis Howe, the club's vice president, best articulated the draw of club curling.
Curling's a very social game, so we happen to be curling very early in the morning right now, but usually there's beer or other beverages involved, and it is a very social game. I would say the social aspect is just as important as the game aspect.
Walking out of the ice factory into the Sunday morning sunshine and near 90-degree weather, I could still hear the clacking of the curling stones in my ears. It would be days before that sound faded from my subconscious. And I am very much looking forward to extended curling coverage during the 2026 Winter Olympics.
Clean! 1, 2, 5 points for the USA! Redemption is achieved! The USA are Olympic champions!
That was Engage producer Richard Copeland visiting the Orlando Curling Club at the Ice Factory in Kissimmee. You can find more information about the club on our website, cfpublic.org.
You're as cold as ice. You're willing to sacrifice our love.
That's all for today's edition of Engage. Remember, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about, what you're glad you heard, what do you want to talk about? Send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.